Participating in this session, you're granting your permission to be recorded and for the recording to be distributed as AIADC and the Washington Architectural Foundation may choose. The exception to this is when we'll be in breakout rooms for a good portion of the session, and those will not be recorded. When we move into those breakout rooms, it might take us just a couple of minutes to get your moderators situated with you, and then they'll help you kick off the discussion. We do appreciate your patience as we work through the intricacies of Zoom settings, but we'll be with you as soon as we possibly can. Last, when we're not in breakout rooms, please do mute your mic and turn off your camera. But to encourage interaction, we do encourage you to turn on your camera and have your mic off, or mic on, I'm sorry, during the smaller group sessions. So thank you again for coming, and I'm pleased to introduce Joel Zinzer, FAIA. Joel, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you so much for all that you've done, and for Marco also. Good evening, everybody. I am Joel Zinzer. I'm a fellow of the American Institute of Architects and a member of AIADC's Fellows Public Programs Committee. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to the second session of this webinar titled A Two-Part Conversation on Equity with Fellows and Emerging Architects. For those of you who were not with us for session one, I hope that you have had a chance to watch the recorded version of the program, which is available on the AIDC website. We're looking forward to everyone's thoughts and contributions in today's discussions. At this time, I'd like to reintroduce our panel members whose participation in session one and now in session two is very much appreciated. First, Howard Mack is a professor at Morgan State University and a board member of the National Organization of Minority Architects. Joseph McKinley is a registered architect and architectural designer with Bonstra Hairsign Architects. He's a member of AIADC's Emerging Architects Committee. Third, we have Ian Walker, who is an architectural associate with Studio 3877 and a member of AIADC's Emerging Architects Committee. Jennifer Matthews is an architectural designer with Sherlock Smith and Adams and a member of AIADC's Equity Committee. Catherine Prigmore is a fellow of the AIA and an associate director at Shalom Baranis Associates and also a NOMA council member. Ronnie McGee is a fellow of the American Institute of Architects and a principal of R. McGee and Associates, which he founded approximately 30 years ago. At the end of session one, there were some questions that remained unanswered by the panel. So we've gone ahead and put together answers to that, and we'll be getting that out soon. You can probably find that most directly on the AIADC website in the next day or so. As a lead-in to today's session, I'm going to try to briefly recap session one. We learned the definition of racism, how it presents itself in society, and how one might view the journey to becoming an anti-racist. We heard brief personal experiences from each of our panel members. They were compelling. And it was a time for listening, learning, reflecting, and thinking about what kinds of actions can be initiated to eliminate the threads of systemic racism from the fabric of the architecture profession, its institutions and associations, and the architecture, engineering, construction community or industry as a whole. Here's a few comments that I received as reflections on session one. First of all, perhaps I'm sorry, I'm lost in my own thoughts here. Perhaps these can work with our chat rooms as well as we move on in the evening. The thoughts that I received, the panelists' comments were real and compelling and informed the audience of issues to be addressed. A quote, "You can't become what you can't see." And in that regard, many K through 12 students are not and will not pursue architecture or any design-based career because they did not grow up knowing anyone who did this. A lack of awareness that the profession of architecture even exists seems to be a significant hole in the fabric of life's choices. Catherine's experiences of being mistaken for the office admin is not unusual. This is worth talking about, and as it relates to entry barriers that still exist. Not only are new graduates trying to battle a learning curve, but also battling stereotypes and comments from fellow employees. Supporting historically Black colleges and universities is an important component to creating a pipeline of future Black architects. It's clear that rising into leadership roles at a majority firm is hard for Black professionals. And therefore, Black professionals have had to start their own companies in order to create their own paths to success. More Black architects in leadership roles are necessary to serve as mentors to young Black architects. And then also we learned that although the acronym JEDI is familiar, the sequence for achieving success may actually be DIEJ, diversity, inclusion, equity, before the ultimate goal of justice. So here's how the program will flow. There will be 6 chat rooms. Each participant has been assigned to one of the 6 chat rooms. Each chat room will have 1 panel member and 1 member of the Fellows Public Programs Committee assigned to facilitate the discussions. Each chat room will have a focus to start with. Awareness of architecture as a profession with Ian Walker and Ralph Cunningham as the leaders. Education with Howard Mack and Michelle Honey as the leaders. Career entry, the next phase, with Jennifer Matthews and Steve Spurlock. Leading to licensing with Joseph McKinley and JP Spickler. And then career roles and responsibilities, various roles that people can play within a firm. And finally, the leadership opportunities with, I'm sorry, did I say Catherine Pigmore and Brenda Sanchez? I don't think I did, but they'll be leading that. And leadership opportunities with Ronnie McGee and Jim Wilsey. The discussions are encouraged to be broadened beyond the topics that I've already listed, especially if someone is in a chat room and you have key information or ideas regarding other facets of the issues of systemic racism. The report outs from the chat rooms will hopefully be full of ideas for actions and next steps that individuals, firms, associations, and/or collaborative groups can further explore or undertake. The FPPC member is charged with capturing the key points coming out of the discussions, and then the FPPC member and the panel member will lead the discussions that follow. There'll be a 2-minute warning before there's a hard stop and a shutdown of the chat rooms, at which point everybody will return to what I now know is called the lobby, and we'll all meet there. At that point, we'll have the report outs and final comments. So let's move to the chat rooms without any further ado. With Ian and Ralph Cunningham in the first group.
Okay, I'll start. I'm Ralph Cunningham, and I'm going to turn it over to Ian in a minute. Our subject was awareness of the field of architecture, and you know, we started by everyone telling their personal story, and you know, I think to summarize that, there are many, many ways into this profession. There are many ways that people become aware of the profession. We had people from international backgrounds. We had people that had family members. We had people that had, you know, various friends or were exposed in K through 12 environments. But I think that the consensus was that there's not enough outreach to K through 12 schools. We had a gentleman from UDC, and we talked a little bit about doing some outreach from UDC to DC public schools, which you would think would not be that difficult, but apparently it is. So, you know, there are many, many different paths into this profession, but we can certainly do more with outreach. And Ian, maybe you want to add to that.
Yeah, just real quick, thank you. I gained a lot of confidence and appreciation for the crew that I had. They inspired me from telling me the stories of how they got here, but also telling me about the volunteer work that they've done in the past. Some of the things I hope we can carry out in DC in the future are things like a summer immersion camp, you know, essentially like a pre-college camp that gets kids on campus for an extended amount of time. You know, they have something like it at Catholic University right now, but I'm talking more geared towards DC public school kids who, quite frankly, aren't even aware of that many colleges in general and what college life could be like. So summer immersion camp, also potential for, someone was talking about in Atlanta, they led an 8-week design charrette over the summer for public schools, like elementary and middle schools. So they spent 8 weeks over the summer, and that was through the university. So university students led it again, but 8-week design charrette. So spending good quality time, breaking down design ideas and showing them, you know, a good breadth of what architecture is, not just designing, but the whole process. Is great, and something that's I've been personally timid to take on, because it seems like a lot of time, a lot of kids, it is a lot of responsibility, but I'm just gaining more confidence knowing that it's been done before and that there's other people who are eager to do it. And so I just want to echo that. If you are interested, let's put it together.
And the last comment was architecture is fun. So we want to communicate that. Joel?
Your 8 minutes are up. You did a good job. Anybody have a compelling thing to say from that group that we missed? Gone. Let's go to Michelle and Howard on education. Unmute, Michelle. Howard and Michelle.
Yes, I got it. We had a very interesting conversation about barriers. And I think the conversation kind of emerged into not only barriers for Black students and Black architects, but barriers for women and barriers for women that might be from different cultures or immigrants to this country, which was very, very interesting. You know, I guess I'm coming away, and I'll have to ask Howard to confirm that many of the Black students, it appears, feel very comfortable in a HSBU environment, but in some cases it was noted that the technology at those institutions might be not as good as others. I mean, to me, I'm not sure that that's an issue, because when I went to school, there was no technology, but because there wasn't any at that point. But it's an interesting fact that Howard also mentioned that there are 7 HBCUs of 130 architecture schools, and that there are more Black women studying architecture today. And my point was, I thought, relatively speaking, when I taught at University of Maryland for a while, and I noticed that there were more architects that were women at that point in time. So I don't know if the whole interest for architecture is shifting to more women. I'm not quite sure that's the case. But then the issue came up about barriers relative to pay and the gap in pay and the time it takes to become registered. And one of the architects mentioned about having his children, one in computer science versus architecture, and how that there was such a huge gap in pay. I mean, that's another barrier that a lot of people may shy away from architecture because of the, challenges with pay. And we talked about one young architect talked about internships, and some young architects can't accept internships because they have to go to another city and they can't really afford it on the pay that they get. So what have I missed? Howard, can you help me out here?
No, I think you covered a good amount of it. One thing I'll just add is we talked about one big thing is just representation. Someone said that you can't be what you can't see, and that is so important, and we cannot forget that. And I gave the example of how I wanted to be an architect. I knew I wanted to be an architect before I knew what it was called since I was 5. But I had no one to show me what an architect was throughout my entire process until I went to architecture school. And luckily I went to an HBCU, which gave me an environment to really catch up on a number of things prior to going to an Ivy League college for graduate school. And so that process is similar to why a lot of Black people flock to HBCUs, because they are able to have a place where they see people who are successful. I mean, that's very important when we want to branch out into other places where we are minorities, and that we need examples, and we need examples to actually be mentors to us, as well as other people who are understanding that they might not be the ideal example, but understanding that we may come from a different background, and then that needs a certain level of understanding and everything to really pull out the quality contributions that we can add.
Let me just add one more thing that stuck in my mind. I think, Howard, you did say this, that there were students that were really gifted, but in many cases they had to drop out, Black architects, that is, young Black architects, because they just couldn't afford to take care of their family and continue with their professional education. So that's something that I think is really, obviously creating a barrier for them personally, and maybe that's something that we as fellows of the AAA may look and see how we might address. So with that, Joel, I'm done.
Thank you. I'm going to add one point because I happened to hear it today listening to a program that the Connecticut AIA was putting on. It had to do with, in the realm, it had all to do with education. But one of the architecture professors talked about this, and I'll leave it for you to just think about, and that is the curriculum or the choice of projects in a school can be part of systemic racism without maybe even knowing it. For example, if the second year design studio has as its project to design a drive-in bank, a drive-up bank in the suburbs, if you've never been in the suburbs, we're dealing with that, that's a problem. It's an unwitting, perhaps, thing that can happen. The other side of the coin that was given by a Black professor at a historically Black university was saying that in that culture, and that they would be very comfortable designing a Black church of a certain denomination or something. So there are things in our profession, is what I'm suggesting, that unwittingly we may come into play in the educational processes. Anyway, that's enough of that. And now we've got to the point for the next group, which is career entry. Jennifer and Steve Spurlock.
Yeah, I'm going to have to start muting you, Joel, if you start going off the range here again. So.
I will. I'll mute myself.
So we had a really, our main topic was, our focus was career entry. We had 6 participants. Ronnie, one of your students, was in our group. And it was interesting because we had 5 women and myself as the token male member. So our conversation kind of morphed a little bit between issues of being a Black architect and being a woman architect, which I found really, fascinating as well. We spent a part of our conversation talking about the barriers to education and a lot of things that I think other groups probably talked about as well. Lack of a role model, lack of mentoring, lack of awareness of the profession. One of the big topics that we talked about was the overhead, the cost of education to be an architect, and how you can come out of school burdened with mountains of debt and enter what is in essence kind of a not a well-paying job. And I think that's something as a profession that we can continue to work on. We talked about the perception of both women and Black architects in the profession and how it's an uphill battle for both of those constituents just to get credibility and to get recognition and to get people to respect them. One of the things that I think the fellows and we could continue to work towards is continuing to develop more and better mentoring programs, especially with emerging young architects coming right out of school, to help mentor them, to get them through those first couple of years, to get them through licensing. Those are all things that we can do. They're things that we can control, and I think we should put a lot of emphasis on that going forward. We also talked about, the challenges of, again, being a woman and entering the profession to begin with, and then if you have children, to the reentry and all the challenges that are associated with that, which I think are things that can be studied further. So, and then, again, we kind of came back again to mentoring, finding out how to find a good mentor. I think we could start, shaming firms and if they don't do good mentoring, and we can set some metrics and we can sort of start going to our membership and getting information back about that. And not only internal mentoring, but also continuing to do these programs where emerging architects can mentor with a more seasoned architect from another firm and get some perspective about their own situation from someone who doesn't have a vested interest in keeping them under control or keeping them on a certain path. So Jennifer, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you take it from here.
Sure. Thanks, Stephen. I think everything you said was spot on. I think one thing that was really apparent in our group is that, barriers to career entry can exist at every single phase of, your progression towards the industry, whether you're a K through 12 and have that lack of awareness, whether you're a college student and you don't see anyone else as far as like a professor or having an advisor that looks like you to, rely on to go to, you graduating and not, having a platform or a mentor to guide you through how to either secure a job post-graduation, or you're entering into your first firm and, that foundation that you need to kind of jumpstart your career is not present, whether, you might deal with, an architect with egos or an architect who feels like the, white male that sits next to you at work is more capable, and you're given only certain tasks to do as far as your opportunities in the firm are concerned. Whether you are going towards licensure and you have barriers of, having a family, if, you are a mom, if you are, in these different categories. I think just to reiterate and hold that, those barriers to career entry exist at just about every single phase. And we kind of discussed all those different phases in our group. And I think, like Stephen said, one of the biggest things is mentorship, having that voice that you can go to talk to at every phase, to understand, what can you do? How can you overcome, having that cheerleader who, tells you that you can make it through licensure and different ways to achieve the goals that you do want to achieve. So I think mentorship was definitely one key thing in our group, and that, peer-to-peer crossover and, collaboration to just, break you out of all the obstacles that you are presented with through this career path. So I think we always went back kind of towards that mentorship, and we did talk a lot about barriers to entry as women in architecture.
Yeah, and then one final thing that sort of kept coming back is the perception, and it's a lot like Catherine's story, where someone asked her where the coffee machine was, and then one of our participants had an experience sitting near the front door of their office, and any delivery person would immediately come to them because that person was Black and it looked like they were the admin person instead of one of the design professionals, you know. So
Right.
we have to look at ways of making more awareness about perception, about who you're looking at, what your name is, you know, and where you know, how you look, you know, so that's all important. So.
And if I can add one small thing like that I'm not shy that did happen to me actually, but also seeing like, you know, fellow employees or leadership, you know, making passive comments towards certain employees, whether it was race, religion, or whatever. You know, one thing that I did say in the group was that, you know, an architect or somebody in a leadership position at a firm, they do have the full capability of eliminating people of color from the industry, whether it's a passive comment or, you know, leadership lets things slide under the table that's clear that, you know, somebody's either being picked on, picked at, not given opportunities. You know, all those things have the complete capability of eliminating people from firm, like young professionals. And that first bad experience can easily send a young professional out of the industry in a heartbeat. And that's very true. And I've heard lots of stories from fellow colleagues who've gone through similar things.
That was very comprehensive and touched on a number of the areas of or steps in the path of a career. Anybody else from that group have a compelling thought? Okay, licensing is the next phase that we've got with JP Spickler and Joseph McKinley.
Great, thanks, Joel. I think we're going to see that there are some definite themes emerging amongst these various groups we were broken out into. And what I hope that means is the solutions or the action items that we define to begin to change the world are going to be tied together. We talked about licensure. I think 2% of the licensed architects in this country are Black. That's a pretty sobering statistic. And another sobering statistic we talked about that was mentioned earlier is of the 120 colleges and universities that are certified by the NAAB, only 7 of them are historically Black colleges and universities. So that's a really limited number. So we talked about, is there a program that can begin for high school students to educate them about the fact that not only, as was mentioned in another group, architecture is a great and compelling profession that they might be well suited for, but that there's a really stringent licensing requirement, and it's something that takes years of planning and understanding and foresight to do. So a program might start that early in one's path to licensure. We talked about half of the individuals in the group were not licensed and half were. So it was great to get that balance of perspectives. The NCARB basically structures the licensing process around 3 fundamental aspects: education, experience, and the examination or the test. So we structured our conversation around that. And what we found was there really is still a gap between education and the requirements of licensure. And we also heard that there was often a vague understanding of what one should be studying for the licensing exam. What some of the comments kept coming back to was really a lack of mentors and supervisors that can begin to reach out to individuals who might not have access to this information and begin to help them along the path to licensure. That was a constant theme in many of the comments that came up. Another sobering statistic, 81% of the NCARB supervisors are male and 88% of them are white. So that's, you know, right there, that illustrates a problem. So there needs to be more diversity in supervisors and mentors who can make connections and help people along these paths. So what is the AIA? What can the AIA do? What can firms do? What can NCARB assist them in doing? That ensures more diversity amongst supervisors and mentors because it's a complex process. The AXP, the Architecture Experience Program, has 96 tasks in 6 experience categories. So and that all has to be documented. And I think there's still a common theme that young budding architects feel that they're doing this largely on their own. And if you're already in a position where you're being disadvantaged, then it's all the more challenging. So again, a strong theme is the need for mentors or supervisors in programs in terms of outreach. We talked about recruiting a little bit too, about the obligation of firms, not just to go back to their alma maters, but to look at HBCUs and other areas for mentoring. And mentoring is a big part of licensure, obviously. So that was a key theme. Another theme that did come up was economics, the wage gap that exists in our society between our profession and society. It's reflected in one and the same. So it costs over $1,400 to take a licensing exam now. So what kind of scholarships or assistance programs might there be for people that are historically disadvantaged by a wage gap? So it's an issue, or the ability to not be able to give of one's time freely because you have to support yourself and a family. So there is an economic pressure we discovered as well, relative to the path to licensure. I think those were some of the major themes. I'll invite Joe to add or expand upon anything else I might have missed.
Thanks. I think that was actually very comprehensive. You covered pretty much everything that I have written down as well. I think we spoke a lot about the cost as well, in terms of with the exam. Some people feeling the exams being kind of vague. What's going to be on the test, and so there's several retakes that have to happen, and then there's this kind of cycle of retaking and then buying more resources in terms of books and study courses. So kind of going on this rabbit hole of spending on tests. So that was an interesting point as well. But otherwise, I think JP covered it, very well. I don't know if anyone else in the room had another comment to add.
Anybody else want to add anything? Okay, let's look at career roles and responsibilities with Brenda Sanchez and Catherine Pigmore. You're on mute.
We're both on mute.
Brenda, you're muted.
Now I'm
Catherine, we can hear
muted.
you.
I'm muted.
Yep, okay.
It's a generational thing.
Catherine, if you could please make the report, because my connection is going on and off.
Sure, Brenda. Okay, so we had an interesting group. I think we had 5. I can't remember. I didn't know I needed to count. 5 or 6. Well, we had one architect. Yes, licensed architect. 1 interior designer, licensed, and a graphic designer in our group as part of the moderators. So we had a really interesting discussion Brenda and I had to kind of reframe some of the thoughts that we had, because we ended up talking about things other than architecture. And one of the things we talked about was why one of the individuals decided not to continue to pursue architecture. And a lot of what was just said about the cost of the process was not tenable for him. And then he also had an interesting perspective working in an architecture firm and seeing all the things that we do as architects that going through school we probably weren't aware of, and maybe those things don't make architecture an appealing career for him anymore. So anyway, it was an interesting discussion. It ranged over a lot of topics. Some of them issues we've already touched on from the other reporting out discussions. So I just want to talk about our ideas for what we can do, because Brenda and I are very focused on outcomes. I think that's partly because of the roles we've played in organizations and architecture firms. So one of them was we need to diversify how we recruit, where we recruit, and how we recruit. Not just from my perspective, however, it's not just going to HBCUs, but when we go to other firms, majority firms, our alma maters or whatever, to seek out minorities in those, sorry, not firms. When we go to majority education programs, to seek out minorities in those programs, to make sure that while we're there recruiting, we touch base with them as well. So it's kind of a twofold approach to recruiting that we all need to encourage, not just our own firms, but firms of our peers to really reassess of how they go about trying to find new employees. And this also goes for, this is my own addition to this, is to recruiting individuals to more senior levels, is to look and not necessarily look where you usually look for individuals, but to be more creative in thinking about what you're doing before you actually go look for somebody. So that was one of the things that we came up with that we can all address. Another one is, and this came partly from the questions from the last session, is the pedagogies in architectural programs. And this is something I think that we in the DC area can start working on, is how do we help academicians develop pedagogies that are more diverse? How do we get them access to the research information or whatever tools they need to help deliver a different type of design program to their students? Because it's not something you can just say, okay, now tomorrow we're going to start designing circuses or whatever. There's time that has to go into developing those things. So, but I think actually this is one of the areas that we as architects can help the academicians focus on. I think it needs to be a joint strategy needs to be developed. Mentorship came up as something that's very important. I think that came up in all of the groups. Another thing that we talked about briefly was having more periodic formal ways to have discussions with individuals in your firm. So the traditional words that is used for this is having performance evaluations, but that has a negative connotation. But I think it's really important for senior members of the firm to touch base with people that work under them, whether they're on their team or they just happen to be other individuals in the office. You can structure this in many ways, but you have periodic structured, and structured means there's an agenda of topics to talk about, and then goals to set for the individual. And at first this may be a little awkward, or people may be uncertain about it, but the more you do it, the more comfortable everyone becomes when you have these opportunities.
Catherine, I hate to cut you off. I do want to get Jim and Ronnie on, and we're probably going to run all the way to the hard stop. I'm just going to mention that in October, the annual more to say about this, and you'll probably see more in when we pull it all together in a written form. So why don't Jim and Ronnie go to the end, and we'll call it. Yeah. If we get a hard stop, that's where we'll.
Yeah, I'm going to do this quickly. So Jim, chime in. We want I hear a theme of mentoring, and that sort of came out in ours too. We talked about how people started in the field. We had Maria, Anta, and Colleen And thank you very much for participating. I know it's late, you've been working all day. Appreciate you participating. The idea that how people started out in the field and whether they got, it seems like mentoring and having a good start where someone looked after your career, paid attention to your career, reached down and participated in your thought processes and was interested in your success was the key to success. Anta is a foreign architect from Portugal, African American woman. She's licensed, and she talked about the issue she has in terms of perception. People don't perceive her as being the project architect when she's a project architect. So I felt that when I started out too. So we talked about some ways to deal with that. We talked about leaders in the firm giving when you start a meeting off with that young architect running that project, you give them, you loan them some of your largesse. This is my person that's going to run this project, and you make sure that people know that person's running the project. There is no doubt. But the idea of the employee also looking upward at do they have access to the leadership? Do they have access to if there are issues? Do you have access backwards and forwards, up and down the chain as to whether you're having issues in the firm? So the idea of making the mentorship and having someone in the firm that you can see that's like you, have someone you can contact and relate to, was very much a factor in the success of the folks we talked to. So small catchment, but it resonated with my career that people participated and helped me, and that's really the key to success. And I think that the person that looks different than you, the peer-to-peer help is not there as much. The leadership help is not there as much. You may not have had the background, the business and other technical background, may have the technical background, but not the business background, be successful without some help from your firm, without somebody taking you under their wing and saying, here's how you do things. That could be every architect, but sometimes a minority architect comes to the firm with less feeling that they're part of the firm, and someone needs to make that happen. Sometimes you can have by accident, sometimes you can do it yourself with your personality, but there has to be some leadership role in that. So the idea of making opportunities available for the young architect, the young minority architects in the firm, letting them know that they're appreciated and that their work is, and if they're making a mistake or they're doing well, making sure they know that. Those kind of things, I think, are where people cited that as factors in their career, and I think that's probably one of the things that's missing for a minority architect in a firm. And so barriers to success would be the feeling that you're not one of the cherished people in the firm because no one's outreaching to you that way. So Jim, what was your take on?
Yeah, I think a couple of things that came out of it that I thought were fascinating that hasn't really come up on these discussions is that as our profession is about doing drawings and designing buildings and solving problems, but it's not just in our offices. We're members of communities, but more importantly, it was how younger people, how people of color are dealing. You drop them in a meeting with consultants, or you ask them to interact with people from other firms that maybe have very different cultures than you do, and that may be less welcoming. Clients the same way. Walking into a meeting with a client, how that client treats that person or how that client reacts to that person is really on the leadership to sort of build those bridges and build them pretty quickly. I think it's still upon the employees and the folks that are coming up in the profession to sort of walk across those bridges, but you've got to build those bridges, and it's up to us as leaders to kind of make sure that we're not leaving people out there to exposed and not prepared to deal with the situations that they're being put in. It was pretty fascinating because you assume okay, well, we've trained, the culture is quite clear, our way of communicating is clear, how we do things is clear, but all of a sudden they're with a contractor or they're with a consultant or they're with a client, and those are all opportunities for growth and opportunities to continue to develop leadership skills, but they're also opportunities fraught with kind of risk, because now the barriers that you can build in the office and the opportunities that you can build within the office are not necessarily there. Those protective layers and those sort of clear lines of communication aren't always there when people are out in the field or they're out at meetings and things. And so I think it's important to empower people, and that the leaders in the companies really need to be empowering their folks to feel comfortable in those situations, but also to step in if those situations go awry, so that they don't happen again. Because there is I think a a bit of a protective mode. I don't mean that in a patriarchal way, but more in like the firm is about this bubble of people or this group of people, and it's fine to do everything you can within that bubble to sort of create, foster, a community of caring and foster a sort of sense of purpose and welcoming for everybody. But those things can fall apart fairly quickly once you walk out the door. And so how do you kind of build a system that's strong enough to kind of, that people feel has their back when they're also in other situations where maybe it's not quite so clear what's going on. So that was fascinating.
We're over our time limit. Those are great points that were just made. All of the points that have been made are terrific. We will be moving forward. This isn't the end. This is the end of our two-part program. But as I said before, we have report outs that will be going to the board. We have an annual meeting at which we're going to pick this up. And the door is open for more ideas, more thoughts, and how the fellows can do whatever it is we can do in our firms, in our individual lives, but collectively to try and accelerate the rate of change. That's really what we want to do. I thank everybody for participating, all of those that came to join us, the panel members in particular for 2 sessions, and my fellow committee members for all your hard work, and thank you. So